There are no dramatic gates opening in the middle of cities, no crowds gathered outside its walls, no daily headlines tracking what happens inside. Most of its facilities sit far from population centers, surrounded by empty highways, open land, and silence. That distance is intentional. It is the first layer of control. The BOP was never designed to be visible. It was designed to function. For nearly a century, it has operated as the federal government's quiet answer to a single question: what do you do with people you consider too dangerous, too influential, or too complex to leave inside ordinary systems of confinement? The answer was not chaos. It was order. But order has a cost. The birth of a centralized prison power. Before the Federal Bureau of Prisons existed, the federal government had no unified prison system. Individuals convicted of federal crimes were scattered across state prisons, local jails, or privately contracted facilities. Conditions varied wildly. Oversight was limited. Control was inconsistent. By the early 20th century, that arrangement was no longer sustainable. Interstate crime was rising. Organized criminal networks were expanding across state lines. Prohibition had fueled large-scale trafficking operations. Federal courts were handing down sentences that states were neither equipped nor motivated to manage. In 1930, the federal government created the Federal Bureau of Prisons to solve that problem. Centralization was the key idea. One authority. One classification system. One philosophy of confinement. From the beginning, the BOP emphasized discipline, uniformity, and administrative control. Rehabilitation existed in theory, but order was the priority. The goal was not to understand individuals, it was to manage populations. That mindset would shape everything that followed. What makes federal prisons different? Federal prisons are often compared to state prisons, but the comparison misses the point. State prison systems are fragmented. Funding varies. Policies shift with politics. Conditions change from region to region. Violence in state prisons often reflects that instability, unpredictable, visible, and sometimes explosive. The federal system is different by design. It operates under a single national authority. It classifies people through standardized risk assessments. It transfers individuals across the country without regard for geography or familiarity. It prioritizes predictability over proximity. In the federal system, people are not kept close to home. They are kept where the system believes they belong. This creates an environment that appears calm on the surface. Assault rates are lower than in many state facilities. Riots are rare. Escapes are almost non-existent. But calm does not mean harmless. When violence became a systemic threat by the late 20th century, the BOP faced a problem that traditional prison management could not solve. A small number of incarcerated individuals continued to disrupt federal facilities regardless of security level. Some assaulted staff during routine movements. Some orchestrated violence indirectly. Some exerted influence simply through presence, intimidating others without ever lifting a hand. Lockdowns failed to neutralize them. Transfers spread the problem. Segregation units became overwhelmed. The system reached a conclusion it would never state openly: as long as people could interact, violence could reorganize itself. So the BOP changed strategy. Redesigning violence out of existence. The solution was not more force. It was less contact. Federal prisons began to shift away from large communal spaces. New facilities were built with narrower corridors, controlled sightlines, and single-occupancy cells. Recreation became individualized. Movement was scheduled, supervised, and limited. Architecture became enforcement. Cells were no longer just places to sleep. They became tools of behavioral control. Lighting was regulated. Sound was dampened. Windows were positioned to show sky but not landscape. The goal was simple: eliminate spontaneity. If people could not gather, they could not riot. If people could not communicate freely, they could not organize. If people could not move without permission, they could not act impulsively. Violence did not disappear. It transformed. Silence as an instrument of power. Modern federal prisons are quiet by design. Doors open electronically. Commands are brief and procedural. Conversations are discouraged. Meals arrive through narrow slots in steel doors. Recreation occurs alone or under heavy supervision. In some units, an individual can go days without meaningful human interaction. This silence is not accidental. It is enforced. And it works, at least by administrative standards. Assault rates decline. Incidents decrease. Facilities become predictable. But the absence of noise hides something else. Violence without bruises. As federal prisons grew quieter, reports of psychological distress increased. Internal assessments, medical records, and later court filings revealed consistent patterns. Anxiety intensified. Sleep disorders became chronic. Concentration weakened. Emotional regulation deteriorated. Some individuals experienced paranoia. Others reported hallucinations. Many withdrew entirely, speaking less, reacting less, becoming emotionally flat. These were not rare cases. They were predictable outcomes. Extended isolation alters the human nervous system. This is not controversial. It is documented. The BOP did not dispute the effects. It absorbed them. Discipline without touch. One of the most striking features of the federal prison system is how rarely physical force is now required. Non-compliance is addressed administratively. Privileges are removed. Movement is reduced. Isolation increases. Punishment is not loud. It is procedural. A rule violation does not lead to confrontation, it leads to restriction. A pattern of violations leads to more restrictive housing. More restrictive housing produces further deterioration, which then justifies continued restriction. The system sustains itself quietly. Administrative segregation becomes normalized. Administrative segregation was originally meant to be temporary, a way to separate individuals during investigations or emergencies. In the federal system, it expanded far beyond that purpose. Special housing units became long-term residences. People were placed there not only for what they did, but for what they might do. Risk assessment replaced behavior as the justification. Once punishment is based on prediction, confinement loses its endpoint. This shift marked a turning point in federal incarceration. The expansion of extreme control. As the BOP refined isolation practices, it began reserving its most restrictive environments for individuals labeled unmanageable. These were people considered too disruptive, too influential, or too dangerous for even high-security facilities. The solution was total separation. This logic laid the groundwork for the Supermax model, but its foundation was built long before any Supermax prison opened its doors. The BOP was already thinking in terms of permanent control. Staff inside the system. Correctional officers in federal prisons operate under strict protocols designed to limit engagement. This is not indifference. It is survival. Consistency reduces manipulation. Distance reduces risk. Predictability reduces incidents. But long-term exposure to controlled environments affects staff as well. Silence becomes normal. Emotional distance becomes routine. Human connection becomes something to manage carefully. The system does not only shape those confined within it. It shapes those who enforce it. The illusion of success by conventional metrics. The Federal Bureau of Prisons appears successful. Violence is lower than in many state systems. Facilities run on schedule. Escapes are rare. From an administrative perspective, the system works. But these metrics measure control, not cost. They do not capture psychological harm. They do not reflect long-term damage. They do not account for what happens after release. And they do not answer the question that lingers beneath the silence. Where Part 1 leaves us, the Federal Bureau of Prisons did not eliminate violence by reforming people. It eliminated visible violence by redesigning confinement itself. Interaction was reduced. Spontaneity was removed. Silence became policy. But silence is not the absence of harm. It is simply harm that no longer announces itself. The moment the system crossed the line by the early 1990s, the Federal Bureau of Prisons faced a narrow but serious dilemma. A small number of incarcerated individuals continued to destabilize even the most secure federal facilities. These were not everyday disciplinary problems. They were people who had attacked staff, orchestrated violence indirectly, or exercised influence so powerful that their presence alone altered the behavior of others. Traditional solutions no longer worked. Transfers failed because influence traveled with the individual. Lockdowns failed because they disrupted entire facilities. Segregation units failed because they still allowed contact. The conclusion was blunt: as long as interaction existed, risk existed. The solution was to remove interaction completely. Supermax, a prison designed for absent Supermax prisons, were not designed to rehabilitate. They were not designed to punish in the traditional sense. They were designed to neutralize. Every feature of a Supermax facility reflects that purpose. Cells are single occupancy by default. Movement is rare, scheduled, and restrained. Recreation occurs alone, often in small concrete enclosures surrounded by walls. Meals are delivered through slots. Communication is monitored, delayed, or eliminated. In many cases, individuals spend 23 hours per day inside a single cell. There are no work assignments. No group programs. No shared meals. No spontaneous conversation. The architecture does not encourage compliance. It enforces it. Time becomes the weapon in Supermax confinement. Time behaves differently. Days do not progress toward anything. Weeks do not mark change. Years do not guarantee relief. Progression out of extreme isolation is theoretically possible, but rarely predictable. Advancement depends on compliance, psychological evaluations, and administrative review. Criteria are often vague. Decisions are rarely transparent. A single incident can reset years of progress. Psychological symptoms can be interpreted as non-compliance. Hope becomes fragile. Without a clear end point, the mind begins to collapse inward. Time stops being something you pass through. It becomes something that presses on you. The psychological cost of permanent isolation. Medical research, internal assessments, and court records agree on one point: prolonged isolation produces predictable psychological harm. This is not debated. Extended confinement without meaningful social interaction alters brain function. Stress responses remain elevated. Emotional regulation deteriorates. Perception changes. Common effects include chronic anxiety, panic responses to routine sounds, memory loss, difficulty concentrating, emotional numbness, paranoia, hallucinations. These symptoms appear even in individuals with no prior history of mental illness. Isolation itself becomes the injury. When illness is treated as risk inside Supermax confinement, psychological deterioration is rarely treated as harm caused by conditions. It is interpreted as a security problem. Disorientation becomes defiance. Emotional outbursts become misconduct. Withdrawal becomes suspicious behavior. The response is rarely relief. It is restriction. Medical staff may intervene, but always within security constraints. Therapy is limited. Contact remains minimal. Medication may be adjusted, but the environment does not change. The system attempts to stabilize individuals while maintaining the conditions that destabilize them. This contradiction defines Supermax confinement. Self-harm in a controlled world. As physical violence declined in federal prisons, self-directed harm increased, especially in isolation units. These incidents rarely make headlines. They occur behind locked doors, under constant surveillance, documented in internal reports few people ever see. Some acts are expressions of despair. Some are attempts to regain control. Some are the result of prolonged psychological collapse. The institutional response is procedural: medical evaluation, risk assessment, increased monitoring, often, restrictions intensify. The environment remains unchanged. The step-down promise facing mounting criticism. The Federal Bureau of Prisons introduced step-down programs, structured pathways designed to transition individuals out of extreme isolation. On paper, these programs appear humane. They offer slightly increased out-of-cell time, limited social interaction, gradual return of privileges. In practice, progression is slow and fragile. Behavioral expectations are strict. Psychological symptoms complicate evaluation. Administrative discretion remains absolute. For some individuals, step-down programs work. For others, they become another layer of control, hope offered conditionally, then withdrawn. When the courts forced the doors open for years, Supermax confinement existed largely outside public scrutiny. What finally exposed it was not a riot or a scandal, but paperwork. Lawsuits. Incarcerated individuals and advocacy groups brought cases arguing that prolonged isolation, especially for people with mental illness, constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Discovery processes forced the release of internal documents. These records showed staff acknowledging psychological deterioration, medical professionals warning about long-term harm, administrators aware of self-harm trends. The issue was no longer ignorance. It was knowledge. Settlements without admission. Most Supermax-related cases ended in settlements rather than landmark rulings. These agreements forced changes: removal of severely mentally ill individuals from extreme isolation, creation of specialized mental health units, improved review procedures, expansion of step-down programs. But they stopped short of dismantling Supermax confinement itself. The system adjusted without surrendering its core logic. Reform with a ceiling. Reforms within the Federal Bureau of Prisons have been real, but limited. Mental health exclusions exist, but thresholds are strict. Oversight mechanisms exist, but transparency is minimal. Language has softened, but conditions often remain unchanged. Solitary confinement becomes restrictive housing. Isolation becomes special management. The words change. The structure remains. Staff inside extreme control. Correctional officers in Supermax facilities operate under constant vigilance. Interaction is minimized. Emotion is regulated. Consistency is enforced. This is not cruelty. It is survival. But prolonged exposure to extreme control environments affects staff as well. Silence becomes normal. Distance becomes reflex. Human connection becomes something to manage carefully. The system shapes everyone inside it. The difference is that staff leave at the end of a shift. Those confined do not. Release does not mean recovery. Some individuals eventually leave Supermax confinement. Some are transferred. Some are released directly into society. Years of extreme isolation do not prepare anyone for reintegration. Social interaction can feel overwhelming. Noise becomes stressful. Trust is fragile. Emotional expression is difficult. The skills required to survive isolation, withdrawal, hypervigilance, emotional suppression, do not disappear when doors open. The damage follows. The federal paradox. From an administrative standpoint, the Federal Bureau of Prisons functions efficiently. Violence is low. Order is maintained. Facilities operate on schedule. But these metrics measure control, not cost. They do not capture psychological harm. They do not reflect long-term consequences. They do not account for what happens beyond the walls. Why the system persists? Supermax confinement continues for one reason: no alternative has replaced it. As long as some individuals are deemed unmanageable in any interactive environment, isolation remains the default solution. The system is not designed to imagine alternatives. It is designed to remove risk. And removal, once normalized, becomes permanent. Final reflection: the Federal Bureau of Prisons did not eliminate violence. It redesigned it. Violence no longer explodes into riots or assaults. It unfolds slowly, through isolation, uncertainty, and time. It leaves fewer marks. It generates fewer headlines. It is harder to challenge. But it is no less real. Federal prisons are quiet now, not because harm ended, but because harm was reorganized. Silence became policy. Isolation became infrastructure. Control became permanent. And once a system learns to function this way, it does not easily turn back.